Hey everyone, welcome back to Upside Down Data. Today I want to talk about Hedera Hashgraph and what it needs to be able to self-sustain itself on its transaction fees. If you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on Twitter. Put a lot of updates about our indicators and more over there. So with Hedera Hashgraph, for those who follow the project, one of its big selling points is how cheap it is. So here I'm just showing the fee schedule for HBAR, and those familiar know that it's quite an inexpensive network to use. It has really high throughput, low fees. So for example, you just want to send some HBAR to someone, it's 1/10,000th of a cent to do so. It's very cheap. Some of the lowest transaction fees that you're going to find in the crypto space. And there are other services you can do as well. Functions related to their consensus service, their token service, file service scheduling, transactions, and their smart contracts, etc. all have different fees that generally tend to be quite low. Even their smart contract service, which tends to be the more expensive thing in a lot of crypto spaces, it's more computationally intensive, is still pretty cheap, although not really at the same level as just sending, HBAR from one account to another. It is a little more expensive, but still relatively inexpensive. So I think a very reasonable question to ask then is, okay, if the fees on HBAR are so low, how can it actually sustain itself on that, right? One of the things that you'd like to see in a network is for it to be profitable, so that would encourage people to run nodes. It would encourage people to be on it. Now, with HBAR, they're not even at a place yet where anybody can run a node, right? It's all permission nodes currently amongst the council members, who are a decentralized group. Well, it's a group of companies and universities and organizations like that around the world that are all running permission nodes. So it's decentralized in the sense that it's a bunch of different organizations that are all making up the governing council, but it's not permissionless decentralization like a lot of other projects use. But when they do eventually transition to that kind of model, you'd want to have a network that's able to sustain itself based on the transaction fees. You want to make it the case that people would want to run nodes because it's profitable to do so. And so the question I want to ask today is HBAR at that point where there's enough revenue coming in from transaction fees that it really is financially self-sustaining, that there is no one needs to prop it up? Because what's happening right now with HBAR is you have a lot of these big organizations running nodes. They probably don't care too much right now about whether or not it's profitable. They're kind of in this for a longer vision, so they're willing to subsidize any kind of running costs. So they're not necessarily worried if transaction fees coming in are offsetting their costs of running their nodes. But when this network will become more fully fleshed out, you'd like to see it actually becoming the case that the fees coming in are more than enough to offset costs of running a node. So this is actually a question that came up during the Hedera Community Town Hall last month in June of 22. They actually addressed this question. Someone asked them, what is the path towards financial self-sustainability? What would you need to see on the Hedera Hashgraph network for it to be self-sustaining, to generate enough revenue to be profitable for node runners and be, desirable for people to run nodes from that perspective? And what the number that they cited here was you want to see about 300 transactions per second. Now, those who know about HBAR know that it's definitely capable of that, right? The limit is 10,000 transactions per second is kind of the upper limit on normal transactions for Hedera right now. And then 300 TPS is the limit for their smart contract service. And this 300 transactions per second that they'd be targeting for self-sustainability, they are assuming an equal split amongst their different services. So amongst, smart contract, file service, token, etc., they're assuming an equal split amongst these because some are more expensive than others. And they say if there is that even split and there are 300 transactions per second, then the network is self-sustaining. That the amount of revenue that's being generated by fees is enough to offset costs of running a node, and it actually is profitable, and it would be worthwhile for people to go out of their way to set up nodes to be able to run this. And that's even taking into account things like the internet speed you need to run a node, the pretty high hardware requirements you need to run a Hedera node, etc. So if that's the case, if we're targeting 300 transactions per second with a roughly even split amongst these different services, I think the next question we want to ask then is, okay, are they there yet? And if they're not there yet, how far away are they? And this is where things get a little bit more, concerning to some degree. So if we look at the kind of current state of the Hedera network and how many transactions are being processed, it's nowhere near 300 TPS. So right now I'm just looking at on hashhash.info. It's one of the block explorers, but all the different ones will give you similar numbers to this. This is saying the real-time transaction per second, currently hovering around 11. But what I did is I actually looked at their 24-hour transactions, divided that by the number of seconds, and you get to about 3.84 transactions per second over the last 24 hours. So that's quite a bit below what they're looking for, right? You know, if they're only kind of on average doing about 3.8 transactions per second and they need 300, you know, we're basically needing 100x in the number of transactions that are happening on the network to get up to that point. And then the other thing that we have to remember as well is that this is assuming that there's a roughly even split in the types of transactions that are being put in. If we flip over here to Dragonglass, which is another explorer for the Hedera network, they have a nice breakdown that you can look at of the breakdown of different transactions across time frames. So I'm just looking at the 1 day time frame here. But we can see that the vast majority of the transactions are actually happening in their crypto service, which actually tends to be one of the cheaper ones. You know, that's where this 1/10,000th of a cent to just move HBARs around. That's probably the bulk of these transfers is being in these. And, you know, even the most expensive one that there is only at 5 cents. So more or less, you know, it's pretty cheap, this service here. That's the biggest chunk. And then the consensus service is the next biggest at 45%. That is, you know, also a very cheap service. The most expensive thing here is 1 cent, but most of the transactions will actually be in more of these range. Again, 1/10,000th of a cent. And we're seeing that the more expensive services like the contract service, the file service, and the token service are absolutely tiny. You know, the token service is 1%. Can't even see the contract and the file service on this pie chart because they're so small. So few people are using those services. And so if this breakdown of the type of transactions were to be carried into the future, and we then have to revise that 300 transactions per second, it would actually be quite a bit higher number of transactions per second you need to hit that self-sustaining point. Because again, we have not yet met that assumption by that original calculation that they gave during the town hall of 300 transactions per second, because that was assuming an equal distribution of transactions. We're actually not seeing that here. And one other thing that's kind of concerning about what's going on right now is that if we look at this graph here, so I'm showing you here, this is just the transaction volume across the entirety of the history of Hedera Hashgraph over here. And we see that, you know, it had been growing all throughout the bull market, you know, kind of going into 21, then kind of falling off going into 2022, as we're recently just fallen off a cliff. And so really we're going in the wrong direction. So if we're trying to achieve 300 transactions per second of equal distribution, you know, we're kind of going the wrong direction. We're seeing transactions actually falling off a cliff here. So is this concerning, right? I think this is the question that we want to ask here. You know, if that's what's needed, is this concerning? Well, in the short term, not really, from the perspective that we're not yet at a point where nodes need to be self-sustaining, right? You know, really right now, the way I kind of view the Hedera network is it's being subsidized by the council members who are actually running these nodes. And, you know, these are large institutions. These are institutions that have a lot of capital. So for them, the cost of running a Hedera node is peanuts. It's pennies. They're not going to really care. You know, they're just going to have a node running somewhere that's going to be just costing them, you know, whatever the energy cost is to run it. It's probably not going to be a big deal for them. They're not going to be all that worried about recouping that loss in, you know, the short term. They're probably just looking more long term. So if we're talking about short term security of the network, you know, it's not going to be that big of a deal. But if we're talking about, you know, what this might mean for the long term, what we do have to be worried about, though, is that once, you know, Hedera tries to actually become more of a self-sustaining model, once they try to bring in, you know, community nodes, really try to decentralize more, make this be a more desirable kind of economic idea for anyone who wants to run a node, we're not in a position now where they could do that sustainably. That's just what we're seeing. They're not in a position, and it's kind of going in the wrong way. Now, obviously, being in the middle of a bear market, it kind of, you know, that's probably one reason why things are falling off. But one of the other things that's going on with HBAR is, you know, I think those familiar with the project know that really Hedera has tried to market itself as an enterprise blockchain, or not blockchain, you know, DLT, you know, as a hash graph. It's not a blockchain. They're trying to market themselves as a enterprise DLT or project. And what that means, what you'd like to see then, is that it not be so susceptible to market or crypto market cycles, right? Because the idea is that if you have a bunch of enterprises, a bunch of businesses building on top of HBAR, you'd want that to be a relatively stable demand, right? If they've integrated it into their workflow, that should mean that regardless of what the price of HBAR is doing, regardless of what the price of Bitcoin is doing or Ethereum is doing, you should hope to see kind of equal demand for HBAR, because if most of the demand is actually coming from its use, the value of the network, using of the network, then it shouldn't be as susceptible to speculation, and you should see kind of equal demand, and the number of transactions should not be falling off a cliff during a crypto bear market. You should actually see that be relatively constant, because people are just using it for some other use cases. We haven't seen that yet, and so what that means is that HBAR has not, or Hedera has not realized that goal yet. And I think we kind of, those who are involved in the space, you kind of knew that already. Really what is going on with Hedera right now is promise. Their hope is that they get to a point where really it's the case that the number of transactions is constant because businesses have adopted to such a large degree. We're not there yet. Now, one of the things they talked about in the town hall that does bear mentioning with this kind of a thing is that for bringing on board big companies in that kind of a way of really integrating something like Hedera Hashgraph into their workflow, it's going to take some time, because first they have to evaluate it, they have to make sure they can trust it, right? They have to make sure it's secure, that it's not going to blow up, because that would be a disaster if you build a whole workflow on top of Hedera Hashgraph and then suddenly the network gets attacked and gets destroyed. You wouldn't want to see that. So there's some onboarding that has to happen where people have to gain trust in the network, see that it's really something that they can trust enough to build something that's really valuable on top of. And so, that's one thing, or maybe just not enough time has happened. Maybe a lot of that work still has to happen before we end up seeing that. But what I do think is going to be important is to watch these metrics very closely, because as we go forward in time further and further, as we would give any kind of enterprises more and more time to get comfortable to get in, if they just don't do it, then that calls into question whether or not they ever will do it, right? And, if that's a big part of the thesis around HBAR, that it's going to become a big enterprise blockchain, you're not seeing that enterprise adoption, then that's concerning. That's a problem. And so that's, I think, a thing that any kind of potential HBAR investor, obviously this isn't financial advice, just make your own opinions. But my opinion, any HBAR investor should be thinking about this. And if your thesis is that enterprise adoption is really what's going to drive HBAR forward, then you have to be asking yourself, all right, how long am I willing to give that? What timeline am I willing to give for that? How long am I willing to wait? And if I'm just waiting years and years and years and I'm not seeing that promise ever being realized, am I still going to wait? Is that promise really worth keeping my funds locked up in HBAR versus somewhere else? That's a question I think we'd all have to ask. Now, for some people, they're willing to wait around for years and years and years. They believe that HBAR will eventually succeed. That's fine. But I think everyone needs to come to their own conclusion about that. And I think there's a lot of, there's not enough discussion about that in a lot of ways. I think promise sometimes is overvalued in the crypto space, whereas at some point you actually need to see the rubber meet the road. You actually need to see that that promise being realized. So that's kind of one of the things that I want to talk about with HBAR is that, right now I still think that the HBAR price, just flipping over to it on TradingView, has largely been driven by speculation so far. It's very much been following the crypto hype cycles. People are investing in based on, promise. It's not really been based on actual adoption and usage. And I think that's where we really need to see happen in this bear market, right? We really would like to see that even in this bear market, we'd like to see businesses, enterprises start adopting it, see this transaction count actually start to rise, even if the price stays depressed, stays low. So what that might mean is that the usage of the network is based more on its utility and not just on speculation. And if we see that happen during this bear market, and especially if we start to see this distribution of transactions start to spread out more utilization of the smart contract service, more utilization of the token service, that would be reassuring. That might mean that Hedera is starting to realize its potential. But if we don't see that, that's where I think we have to really be questioning that thesis about enterprise adoption. And that might suggest that, is HBAR really going to ever realize that promise? Obviously, I'm not going to tell you what you should think, what you should believe. That's up for you to make those determinations. But I did just want to point those out as, in my opinion, being very critical metrics to watch with HBAR going forward. Does it realize its potential or not? If it does, great. That means that it has a very bright future ahead of it. If it doesn't, that's where I get very concerned and might think that HBAR, as great as its fundamentals might be, as great as its potential might be, if it doesn't get that adoption, that really calls into a question its long-term viability. All right, if you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on Twitter. Put a lot of updates, better indicators, and more over there.